People say they understand gravity. They say it confidently, casually, as if saying the word itself solves the mystery. But the truth is uncomfortable. Most people don't understand gravity at all. They recognize its effects and mistake that for understanding. When you drop an object and it falls, you haven't explained gravity, you've just noticed it happening. The moment you say, objects fall because gravity pulls them, you've done something sneaky. You've replaced a mystery with a word and pretended the mystery is gone. It isn't. Ask a simple question. What does pull actually mean here? Where is the pulling happening? Through what mechanism? At what moment does space decide now you fall? Most explanations collapse right there. People like to imagine gravity as a force reaching out across empty space, grabbing things like invisible hands. That picture feels satisfying, and it's wrong. Nature does not operate to satisfy human imagination. What actually happens is stranger. Objects are not being dragged through space, they are following the shape of space itself. And that sentence should make you uncomfortable, because it doesn't behave like anything in daily life. Space is not a stage where things happen. Space is part of what happens. And here's where people really get lost. Using mathematical formulas doesn't automatically mean understanding. A formula can predict behavior perfectly and still tell you nothing about why reality behaves that way. We can calculate gravity with stunning accuracy. We can send spacecraft across the solar system using it. But if you ask, why does mass affect space at all? The honest answer is, we don't know. And that's not weakness, that's intellectual integrity. The universe doesn't owe us explanations that fit inside our intuition. Our brains evolved to throw rocks and avoid predators, not to understand the structure of space-time. So when someone tells you they fully understand gravity, be careful. They may understand how to use it, not what it is. Real understanding begins when you're willing to say, I can describe what happens with incredible precision, but the deeper reason remains mysterious. That humility is not ignorance. It's the starting point of real science. Gravity isn't simple, and pretending it is, that's what everyone gets wrong. People say gravity is a force. That single sentence has done more damage to understanding than almost anything else in science. It sounds harmless, sensible, even educated, but it quietly sneaks in a picture that doesn't belong there, a picture of something reaching across empty space and pulling on objects like an invisible rope. Once that image settles in your mind, real understanding becomes almost impossible, because nothing in nature behaves that way. When you say force, you're borrowing from everyday experience. A hand pushes a door, a magnet pulls a piece of iron. You can point to where the force comes from, how it's applied, and what changes when you remove it. Gravity doesn't fit that pattern, and pretending that it does is where the confusion begins. Drop a stone, it falls. So you say gravity pulled it. But that statement explains nothing. It just repeats the observation using a word that feels explanatory. If I ask how the stone knows which way to fall, or why it accelerates instead of moving at a constant speed, or where the pulling is coming from, the answers suddenly become vague. That's not understanding, that's vocabulary hiding ignorance. What's actually happening is far stranger than a pull. The stone is not being yanked downward by some cosmic hand. It is moving exactly as it would if nothing were acting on it at all. That idea sounds absurd until you realize the mistake. You've been assuming space is passive. It isn't. Space is part of the physical system, and it has structure. Imagine removing gravity entirely, not just the force, but the concept, as people usually imagine it. What remains is an object moving nadir, ally following the geometry of the space it exists in. The motion feels forced only because the geometry isn't what your intuition expects. Your intuition wants straight lines. Nature doesn't care. Mass changes the structure of space and time in its vicinity, not metaphorically, not poetically, physically. Objects nearby aren't pulled, they are guided. They move along the paths that space itself makes available to them. The stone falls because that is the straightest possible path in a curved environment. This is where most people stop listening. Not because it's wrong, but because it refuses to match common sense. Common sense evolved to survive at human scales. It works for throwing balls and stacking boxes. It breaks completely when you apply it to the universe. Gravity doesn't feel intuitive because intuition was never meant to handle it. Calling gravity a force makes you feel like you've tamed it, like you've put a wild idea into a familiar box. But all you've really done is trade accuracy for comfort. And comfort is the enemy of understanding. You can calculate gravitational effects with incredible precision. You can predict orbits, tides, and the bending of light. You can build technologies that rely on those predictions. None of that requires you to imagine a pulling force. The mathematics works because it respects the structure of reality, not because it agrees with human intuition. Here's the uncomfortable part. Even with all that math, we still don't know why mass affects space at all. We can describe how it does. We can measure it. We can test it. But the deeper reason remains hidden. And pretending gravity is just another force delays that realization. Real knowledge doesn't begin with confident answers. It begins when you notice that your explanations are too simple. When people insist gravity is a force, they're often defending a mental shortcut. It's easier to picture a pull than to accept that space itself can have shape, that time can slow down, that motion can be natural without being driven. But the universe is under no obligation to be easy to picture. The mistake isn't in using the word force casually. The mistake is believing that the word captures what's really going on. Gravity is not a thing reaching out and acting on objects. It is a relationship between mass, space, and motion. Once you see that, the falling stone stops being a mystery disguised as an answer. It becomes a clue, a hint that the universe is structured in a way that no everyday analogy can fully capture. And that realization matters more than any formula. Because the moment you stop demanding that reality behave like your intuition, you finally give yourself a chance to understand it. Saying that something happens is not the same as explaining why it happens, and confusing the two is one of the oldest mistakes people make when talking about gravity. When an object falls, everyone agrees on what they saw. The disagreement begins the moment someone claims they've explained it. The explanation usually sounds confident. Mass attracts mass. Gravity pulls things downward. Objects fall because of a force. Each sentence feels complete. Each sentence gives the listener the false comfort of understanding. And none of them answer the actual question. Describing an effect is easy. You point, you label, you repeat what your eyes already told you. Explaining something means uncovering the mechanism that makes the effect unavoidable. Gravity is where people stop at the description and pretend the job is finished. If I tell you that a clock stops because the batteries are dead, I've explained something. If I tell you it stopped because it stopped ticking, I've said nothing. Yet that's exactly how most gravity explanations work. Objects fall because gravity pulls them. Gravity pulls because objects fall. The reasoning loops back on itself, sounding technical but going nowhere. This confusion survives because the descriptions are accurate. Objects really do fall. Planets really do orbit. Light really does bend near massive objects. But accuracy is not the same as understanding. A weather report can describe a storm perfectly without explaining the physics that caused it. People assume that adding a scientific word turns a description into an explanation. It doesn't. A word is just a label. The moment you stop questioning the label, you stop learning. Ask a simple follow-up question. How does gravity do what it does? Not what happens, but how it happens. At that point, most explanations begin to unravel. The language becomes vague, the gestures become larger, analogies replace mechanisms. That's not failure, it's exposure. It reveals where understanding ends and memorization begins. The universe does not run on summaries. The real explanation of gravity doesn't start with falling objects. It starts with the structure of space and time. It starts by abandoning the idea that space is an empty container where things move independently. Space is not passive. Time is not universal. Motion is not absolute. None of these statements come from observing an apple fall. They come from asking why it must fall the way it does. Once you see that, the falling object stops being the explanation and becomes the evidence. The orbiting planet is not the cause of gravity. It is a consequence. Descriptions point outward. Explanations point inward. This difference matters because descriptions don't scale. They work only where you've already seen the effect. Explanations let you predict new behavior. They tell you what will happen in situations no one has observed yet. Gravity only became useful as a scientific concept when it stopped being a list of behaviors and became a structure that could be applied universally. There is also a psychological trap here. Descriptions feel satisfying because they align with intuition. You already believe objects fall, so hearing it stated confidently feels like confirmation. Explanations often feel unsettling because they replace familiar pictures with abstract relationships. The brain resists that discomfort and clings to the story it already knows. That resistance is the enemy of progress. When someone says they understand gravity because they know what it does, they're mistaking recognition for insight. You can recognize a face without knowing anything about the person's thoughts. Gravity is no different. Observing its behavior tells you almost nothing about its nature. And here's the part people don't like admitting. Even the best explanations we have are incomplete. We can describe the structure of space-time with astonishing precision. We can predict gravitational effects with numbers that agree with experiments to absurd accuracy. But when you ask why space-time has this structure in the first place, the answer runs out. That's not a flaw of science, that's honesty. Confusing description with explanation creates arrogance. It makes people think the problem is solved when it isn't. It shuts down curiosity and replaces it with repetition. Real understanding stays alert to the gap between what we see and why it must be that way. Gravity forces that humility on us. It reminds us that naming a phenomenon does not tame it. Listing its effects does not reveal its cause. Understanding begins only when we stop being satisfied with what happens and insist on knowing how reality makes it inevitable. And the moment you see that difference clearly, gravity stops being a familiar idea and becomes what it truly is, one of the deepest questions we've ever asked about the universe. The easiest way to hide that you don't understand something is to learn the right words and use them confidently. Most people don't realize they're doing it. They think speaking fluently means thinking clearly. But fluency and understanding are not the same thing. Words can become a shield, a way to stop questions instead of answering them. Gravity is a perfect example. Say force, attract, ion, curvature, or field, and people relax. The vocabulary signals competence. The conversation ends. No one asks what those words actually mean because the words sound like meaning. But a word is not an explanation, it is a placeholder. It marks the spot where understanding is supposed to go. The danger begins when the placeholder is mistaken for the thing itself. When someone says mass attracts mass, it feels like knowledge. Yet nothing has been explained. The word attracts carries emotional weight from everyday life. Magnets, hands pulling objects closer. But gravity does not behave like those things. The word borrows clarity from unrelated experiences and smuggles it into a context where it doesn't belong. This is how ignorance survives among intelligent people. You can memorize definitions, recite equations, and repeat accepted phrases while understanding almost nothing about the underlying reality. The words become a performance. They create the illusion of mastery, especially to others who share the same vocabulary and the same blind spots. Real understanding is quieter. It hesitates. It asks uncomfortable questions. It is willing to say, I don't know what that word actually refers to. Most people avoid that moment because it feels like failure. In reality, it's the only honest place to start. Language evolved to help us coordinate actions, not to reveal the structure of the universe. It works beautifully for everyday life and badly for fundamental physics. When we forget that limitation, we confuse linguistic convenience with truth. Take any popular explanation of gravity and strip away the technical terms. What remains is often nothing more than a description of motion. Objects fall, planets orbit, light bends. The words decorate the observation but don't penetrate it. That decoration is seductive. It lets us feel informed without being challenged. It replaces curiosity with confidence. And confidence, when it isn't earned, blocks learning. The real test of understanding is simple and brutal. Can you explain the idea without relying on the word itself? If you remove the term gravity and nothing meaningful remains, you never understood gravity. You only learned when to say the word. This is not a criticism of learning terminology. Technical language is necessary, but it is dangerous when treated as the destination instead of the tool. Words should point beyond themselves. When they don't, they become intellectual furniture, impressive, heavy, and useless. Science advances by refusing to let words settle into complacency. Every serious idea is constantly pressured. What does this term refer to? What observation forces us to use it? What would happen if it were wrong? When that pressure disappears, science turns into ritual. Gravity exposes this weakness because it resists everyday imagery. The more you lean on familiar language, the more misleading it becomes. You can say space curves, but what does curvature mean without embedding surfaces in higher dimensions? You can say time slows, but compared to what? Each phrase opens a door and immediately pretends it has answered the question. That's not dishonesty. It's a limitation. The mistake is forgetting it's a limitation. True knowledge doesn't hide behind words. It uses them carefully, temporarily, and with awareness of their flaws. It treats every term as a question mark, not a conclusion. This is why the most dangerous sentence in any intellectual discussion is, everyone knows what that means. That sentence marks the exact moment thinking stops. Understanding begins when words fail, when explanations become awkward, when you feel the gap between what you can say and what is actually happening. That discomfort is not a sign of ignorance. It's evidence that you're finally approaching something real. Gravity doesn't become clearer as vocabulary grows more polished. It becomes clearer when you stop mistaking polished language for insight. Words are too. When they stop revealing and start concealing, the honest response is not to speak louder, but to think harder. The universe does not care what feels reasonable to you. That may be the most important thing to understand before trying to understand gravity, because almost every mistake people make begins with the same assumption, that reality should behave in a way that matches human intuition. It won't. It never has. Intuition is a survival tool. It evolved to help us judge distance, speed, weight, and danger at human scales. It is excellent for crossing streets and throwing stones. It is completely unreliable when applied to the structure of the universe. Yet we keep trusting it. We expect causes to be local. We expect time to tick the same for everyone. We expect space to sit quietly in the background while objects move through it. These expectations feel obvious because they work in everyday life. Gravity violates all of them, and intuition fights back by trying to force it into familiar patterns. That's why people insist on imagining gravity as a pull. Pulling is something we understand. Curved space is not. So the mind chooses the comfortable picture and ignores the consequences. Nature does not negotiate with comfort. When experiments contradict intuition, the experiment wins. Always. Reality does not adjust itself to match the way humans prefer to think. It behaves the way it behaves, and our job is to adapt our thinking to it, not the other way around. This is why gravity feels strange even after years of exposure. Nothing in ordinary experience prepares you for a universe where straight lines bend, clocks tick at different rates depending on motion and position, and falling can be the natural state of motion rather than a response to a force. The resistance to these ideas isn't intellectual, it's psychological. The brain is wired to expect stability and simplicity. Gravity offers neither. It demands that you abandon the idea of absolute time and fixed space, concepts that feel as solid as the ground beneath your feet. That ground, incidentally, is not holding you up because of a force pulling you down. It's preventing you from following your natural path through space-time. Intuition hates that sentence. Reality doesn't care. Every major advance in understanding gravity required ignoring what felt obvious. The motion of planets does not follow perfect circles, no matter how aesthetically pleasing circles may be. Light does not travel in straight lines near massive objects, no matter how deeply straight lines are embedded in human reasoning. Time does not flow uniformly, no matter how desperately intuition demands it. These facts are not philosophical, they are measurable. You can build instruments that detect them. You can run technologies that fail if you ignore them. Intuition can complain all it wants. The universe remains unmoved. The problem arises when people treat intuition as evidence. When something feels wrong, they assume it must be wrong. That instinct is useful in daily life and disastrous in science. Gravity teaches this lesson relentlessly. The more intuitive an explanation feels, the more likely it is to be misleading. Understanding requires discipline. It requires the willingness to hold an idea that feels wrong because the evidence demands it. That is not a natural human skill. It has to be trained. This is why genuine comprehension often feels fragile. You're constantly aware that your mental pictures are approximations, metaphors, scaffolding that may collapse under better data. That discomfort is not a flaw. It's the price of accuracy. The universe does not reward belief. It responds only to interaction. You can deny gravity's implications, misunderstand them, or find them ugly, and your GPS system will still fail if you ignore relativistic effects. Nature enforces its rules without explanation or apology. The lesson is not to abandon intuition entirely, it's to recognize its limits. Intuity. On is a guide at familiar scales and a liar at fundamental ones. Gravity lives at those deeper levels, where comfort must be sacrificed for truth. The moment you stop demanding that reality make sense to your instincts, you gain the freedom to actually understand it. Nature does not care how you think it should behave. It only cares how it does, and that indifference is exactly what makes it worth studying. The moment you think a formula is the answer, you've stopped asking the most important question. Formulas are powerful. They predict outcomes with astonishing accuracy. They let us calculate trajectories, energies, and motions with confidence that borders on arrogance. And that success hides a dangerous misunderstanding. Prediction is not explanation. A formula tells you what will happen if certain conditions are met. It does not tell you why the universe obeys that rule in the first place. When people confuse those two, science turns into bookkeeping. Gravity is often presented as solved because the math works. The equations agree with observation to an almost absurd degree of precision. Satellites stay in orbit. Time corrections keep navigation systems functioning. The numbers never lie. But numbers are not reasons. You can write down a perfect formula and still have no idea what reality is doing underneath it. The equation does not cause gravity. The equation describes a pattern we have noticed. It compresses behavior into symbols and relationships. That compression is useful, but it is not understanding in the deepest sense. The universe is not consulting our mathematics before it acts. This distinction is uncomfortable because formulas feel final. They carry authority. They end arguments. When someone writes symbols on a board, the conversation stops. But stopping the conversation is not the same as finishing the inquiry. Gravity forces this humility because even our best equations leave questions untouched. We can describe how mass influences the structure of space and time. We can calculate the resulting motion of objects within that structure. But when you ask why mass has that influence at all, the trail ends. Not with an answer, with silence. That silence is not failure. It is information. It tells us where knowledge ends and mystery begins. Pretending otherwise replaces curiosity with complacency. There is a temptation to treat science like a ladder. Climb high enough and you reach certainty. Reality is messier. Each advance replaces old questions with deeper ones. The better the formulas become, the more sharply the limits stand out. Gravity is not mysterious because it is poorly understood. It is mysterious because it is understood well enough to expose what we do not know. The math works because the universe behaves consistently. That consistency is astonishing. It does not need to exist. The fact that reality can be captured by mathematical relationships at all is one of the deepest puzzles we face. Writing the formula down does not solve that puzzle. It highlights it. People often want explanations that feel mechanical, gears turning, forces pushing, causes acting locally. Gravity refuses to cooperate. It replaces mechanisms with geometry, action with structure, force with relation. The equations express that shift, but they do not justify it. This is where intellectual honesty matters. You can either pretend the formula is the explanation, or you can admit that it is a map, not the territory. Maps are invaluable. They are not the landscape. Real understanding requires living with that distinction. It requires accepting that some of the most successful ideas in science are also the most incomplete. The power of a theory is not measured by how comfortable it feels, but by how much reality it captures without lying about what remains unknown. The danger of overconfidence is subtle. When people believe the formula is the truth, they stop looking for deeper structure. They confuse effectiveness with completeness. History shows how fragile that assumption is. Every time we thought the equations were final, nature disagreed. Gravity will likely do the same again. The correct response to a powerful formula is not reverence but curiosity, not silence but sharper questions. The equation should not close the book. It should open it wider. Understanding does not mean eliminating mystery. It means knowing exactly where the mystery begins. Gravity teaches this lesson brutally and beautifully. We can predict it. We can use it. We can rely on it. And still, when we ask why the universe is built this way rather than another, the formula has nothing to say. That is not a weakness of science. It is its strength. Because the moment you accept that the real mystery lies beyond the symbols, you stop mistaking answers for understanding, and you start doing the kind of thinking that actually moves knowledge forward. Imagine someone stands up and says, "I have calculated a planet with a 99.7% chance of life." Your first reaction should not be excitement. Your first reaction should be suspicion, because numbers don't make something true. Methods do. A percentage without an explanation is not science, it's decoration. To say life exists somewhere is easy. To prove it is brutally hard. You must ask, what do you mean by life? Chemistry, metabolism, reproduction, error correction? If you don't define the terms, you are not discovering, you are guessing. The universe is not impressed by our confidence. It doesn't reward hope. It only responds to experiments that can fail. If your idea cannot be proven wrong, it is not science. It is belief wearing a lab coat. Now consider this. The same equations that suggest life is common can also show how fragile it is. One missing molecule, one unstable orbit, one star that flares too often, and your beautiful probability collapses to zero. This is why real thinkers fall in love not with answers, but with questions that hurt. The goal is not to be right. The goal is to not fool yourself, because you are the easiest person to fool. So if someone claims a planet with a 99.7% chance of life, the correct response is not applause. It is curiosity sharpened into a knife. Show me the assumptions. Show me what would prove you wrong. Show me the experiment. Because the moment we stop questioning our most exciting ideas, we stop doing science and start telling comforting stories to ourselves in the dark. And the universe does not reveal its secrets to storytellers. It reveals them to those brave enough to doubt even their best ideas. Your original idea was weak because it relied on a false claim. This version is strong because it teaches people how to think, not what to believe. Extraordinary claims are cheap. Evidence is expensive. Anyone can announce a discovery. Anyone can attach a dramatic number to an idea and demand attention. But the universe does not care about our announcements. It does not reward confidence, volume, or popularity. It only responds to work that survives contact with reality. When someone says there is a 99.7% chance of life, the sentence sounds powerful, but power is not the same as truth. Numbers feel authoritative because they look precise, yet precision without foundation is theater. A percentage is meaningless, unless you can trace every step that produced it and show where it could collapse. Otherwise, it is not a result. It is a performance. Real understanding begins with discomfort. You must ask what assumptions were smuggled in before the calculation even started, what definition of life was chosen, and more importantly, which definitions were quietly ignored. Is life reduced to chemistry, to replication, to information processing, or to something we have not yet imagined? Each choice narrows the conclusion, and each narrowing hides uncertainty. Ignoring this does not make an idea stronger, it makes it fragile. Nature is ruthless. It does not bend to elegant theories or beautiful equations. A planet can sit in the so-called perfect zone and still be dead. A single unstable orbit, a violent star, a missing chemical pathway, and all probabilities collapse to zero. This is not pessimism, it is respect for complexity. The universe is not obliged to cooperate with our expectations. The most dangerous moment in thinking is when an idea feels complete. That sense of closure is seductive because it promises certainty, and certainty feels like control. But science does not advance by protecting ideas. It advances by attacking them. The strongest ideas are those that invite assault because they have something solid to defend themselves with. If a claim cannot clearly state how it could be proven wrong, it is not a scientific claim. It is a belief disguised as intelligence. The requirement is simple but unforgiving. Show the experiment that LD embarrass you if the result went the other way. Without that, you are not searching for truth. You are searching for confirmation. We like to imagine discovery as a dramatic moment, a flash of insight that suddenly reveals how things really are. In reality, discovery is mostly failure. It is the slow elimination of ideas that almost worked. Every wrong turn teaches us where not to look. Every negative result sharpens the question. Progress is not made by bold claims, but by careful rejection of attractive mistakes. This is why skepticism is not cynicism. Skepticism is a form of respect for reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. To question a claim is not to attack the person who made it. It is to take the claim seriously enough to test it. Flimsy ideas need protection. Strong ideas demand opposition. The real enemy of understanding is not ignorance. Ignorance can be cured. The enemy is the illusion of knowledge, the feeling that we know more than we actually do. Once that illusion sets in, curiosity dies. Questions feel unnecessary. Doubt feels like weakness. And thinking stops. A mind trained to chase evidence learns humility. It learns that being wrong is not a failure but a correction. Every time reality disagrees with us, we gain something more valuable than pride. Alignment with the way the world actually works. That alignment is rare, fragile, and worth defending. So when you hear an extraordinary claim, resist the urge to be impressed. Be curious instead. Ask what had to be assumed for the claim to survive. Ask what observation would destroy it. Ask how much is truly known and how much is being guessed with confidence. Because in the end, the universe does not yield its secrets to those who speak the loudest or calculate the flashiest numbers. It yields to those who are patient enough to doubt, disciplined enough to test, and honest enough to admit when an idea, no matter how exciting, turns out to be wrong. Extraordinary claims are cheap. Evidence is expensive, and truth is paid for in full or not at all. Probability without method is just a fancy guess. It sounds scientific, it looks precise, and it carries the authority of mathematics, but without a clear path that leads to it, a probability is nothing more than confidence dressed up as rigor. The danger is not that such guesses exist, but that we forget they are guesses and start treating them as conclusions. A number feels safe, it feels controlled. Saying maybe sounds weak, but saying there is a 92.4% chance feels responsible, even if no one can explain where that number came from. The human mind is easily impressed by precision, yet nature is not. Nature does not respond to decimals, it responds to mechanisms. If you cannot show the machinery behind the number has no authority. Method is what turns curiosity into knowledge. It forces you to define what you are measuring, what you are ignoring, and why. Without method, probability floats freely, disconnected from reality. You can assign a percentage to almost anything if you are willing to hide uncertainty inside assumptions. The more assumptions you hide, the cleaner the final number looks, and the more misleading it becomes. Consider how easily probability can be abused. Change the definition of success, and the likelihood shifts. Remove inconvenient variables, and confidence rises. Assume independence when none exists, and suddenly the universe looks predictable. These are not small errors, they are structural failures. They do not slightly weaken a conclusion, they invalidate it. Real methods are uncomfortable because they expose ignorance. They force you to admit what you do not know and quantify how much it matters. They make uncertainty visible instead of burying it. A good method does not guarantee a dramatic result, it guarantees an honest one. That honesty often leads to messy conclusions, wide error bars, and probabilities that refuse to be impressive. This is why serious thinking avoids premature numbers. Before asking how likely, you must ask based on what? What evidence exists? How was it measured? How reliable is it? What alternative explanations remain? A probability that cannot answer these questions is not an answer at all. It is an illusion of progress. The discipline of method also protects us from ourselves. We are not neutral observers. We want certain outcomes to be true, and that desire quietly shapes our calculations. We notice evidence that supports us and overlook what challenges us. A method, properly designed, is a defense against this bias. It is a way of saying, I do not trust my intuition, so I will build a system that corrects it. Without that discipline, probability becomes a storytelling device. It reassures, persuades, and impresses, but it does not explain. It replaces understanding with comfort. The problem is not that the story is false. The problem is that it cannot be checked. And what cannot be checked cannot be improved. Science advances not by guessing better, but by testing harder. A probability earns respect only when it survives attempts to break it. When new data arrives, the number must be allowed to change or die. If it is protected from revision, it is no longer a probability. It is a belief. The most reliable thinkers are those who treat every number as provisional. They see probability not as a verdict, but as a temporary summary of incomplete knowledge. It is a snapshot, not a destination. The moment you forget this, you stop learning. In the end, probability is a powerful tool, but only when anchored to method. Without that anchor, it drifts, convincing and useless at the same time. It gives the feeling of understanding without the substance, and feeling informed is far more dangerous than knowing you are ignorant. So be wary of clean percentages and confident predictions. Ask how the number was built, what assumptions hold it up, and what would cause it to collapse. Because until a probability is earned through method, it is not insight, it is just a fancy guess, and the universe has never been fooled by those. Nature doesn't care what we want to be true. It does not negotiate with our hopes, our fears, or our favorite ideas. It does not adjust its behavior to match our expectations or reward us for how much we believe in something. Reality operates by its own rules, and those rules remain unchanged whether we understand them or not. This indifference is uncomfortable because it strips us of a comforting illusion that desire has any influence over truth. We want the universe to be simple, meaningful, and aligned with our intuition. But wanting does nothing. A bridge collapses if the calculations are wrong, no matter how strongly the engineer believes in it. A disease progresses if the treatment fails, regardless of optimism. The world does not respond to sincerity, it responds to correctness. Most errors in thinking are born from emotional attachment. We fall in love with explanations because they feel elegant or satisfying. Once attached, we begin protecting them. We explain away contradictions, we ignore inconvenient facts, we reinterpret evidence so it fits the story we already prefer. This is not stupidity. It is human nature. But human nature is precisely what disciplined thinking must guard against. Reality has a way of humiliating unchecked confidence. An idea can survive endless discussion and still collapse the moment it meets an experiment. Words are cheap. Nature is expensive. It charges full price for every misunderstanding. When a theory fails, it does not fail gently. It fails completely without apology. This is why evidence matters more than intention. You can be honest, intelligent, and deeply committed and still be wrong. Truth is not awarded for effort. It is discovered through confrontation with facts that do not care about your feelings. The sooner this is accepted, the faster learning begins. The most dangerous phrase in intellectual life is, "It must be true." That phrase signals that desire has replaced verification. The moment you feel that something has to be correct, you stop testing it. You start defending it. And the defense of an idea is the end of its growth. Progress depends on the willingness to be disappointed. Each time reality refuses to match our expectations, we are given an opportunity to correct our understanding. This requires humility, because it means admitting that our mental picture of the world was flawed. But humility is not weakness, it is accuracy in the face of complexity. Nature's indifference is not cruelty, it is clarity. Because the rules do not change, we can learn them. Because the universe does not lie, our mistakes are exposed. Every failed prediction narrows the range of what might be true. Every experiment that disagrees with theory teaches more than one that agrees. The goal, then, is not to protect ideas we like, but to test them until they either earn survival or collapse. An idea that survives this process becomes reliable. An idea that cannot survive does not deserve loyalty, no matter how attractive it once was. This mindset transforms curiosity into discipline. You stop asking what you hope is true and start asking what the evidence allows. You trade comfort for clarity, and while clarity can be unsettling, it is the only path to real understanding. In the end, the universe offers no guarantees, no reassurance, and no shortcuts. It offers only consistency. Those who accept that indifference, who stop demanding that reality agree with them, gain something rare, the ability to see the world as it is, not as they wish it to be. Nature doesn't care what we want to be true, and that is precisely why, if we are honest and patient enough, it can teach us everything we need to know. Real science survives being questioned. Lies don't. This single fact separates understanding from illusion. Anything that collapses under scrutiny was never knowledge to begin with. It was a fragile construction protected by silence. Truth does not fear inspection. It invites it. Questioning is not an attack on science. It is the engine that drives it forward. Every serious idea is born with the expectation that it will be challenged. Measurements will be repeated. Assumptions will be exposed. Conclusions will be pushed until they either hold or break. If an idea cannot survive this process, it does not deserve to survive at all. Lies depend on obedience. They require agreement, authority, and the absence of doubt. The moment someone asks the wrong question, the structure begins to crack. This is why false ideas are often surrounded by intimidation, certainty, and emotional pressure. They replace evidence with confidence and criticism with hostility. Their weakness is not intellectual. It is structural. Real knowledge behaves differently. It remains intact when challenged because it is built from independent pieces that support one another. Remove one assumption, and the conclusion may weaken, but it does not vanish. Test it from another angle, and the result remains consistent. This resilience is not accidental. It is the product of methodical skepticism applied over time. The act of questioning does something deeper than error correction. It reveals hidden assumptions, the silent premises we forget we are relying on. Many ideas sound convincing only because their assumptions are never spoken aloud. Once exposed, those assumptions can be tested, refined, or discarded. This process is not destructive, it is clarifying. A culture that discourages questions is a culture afraid of discovery. When doubt is treated as disloyalty, knowledge stagnates. Progress requires an environment where asking, "How do you know?" is not an insult but a responsibility. Without that pressure, even intelligent people can convince themselves of nonsense. The strength of science lies in its willingness to embarrass itself. Failed predictions are published. Incorrect models are replaced. No reputation is sacred. This openness is not chaos, it is quality control. Each public failure removes a piece of error from the system, leaving it more accurate than before. Lies, on the other hand, must remain static. They cannot adapt because adaptation would expose contradiction. They resist revision because revision admits fallibility. As new evidence appears, lies multiply explanations to protect the original claim, creating complexity without understanding. This is how deception reveals itself, not by simplicity, but by defensive elaboration. Questioning also protects us from authority. Credentials, status, and confidence are not evidence. They can guide attention, but they cannot replace proof. A statement does not become true because it is spoken by someone respected. It becomes true only if it matches reality. Science institutionalizes this humility by separating the claim from the claimant. The habit of questioning is uncomfortable because it destabilizes certainty. It forces us to live with provisional conclusions and incomplete answers. But certainty gained without challenge is worthless. It feels strong, but it shatters on contact with reality. Uncertainty tested by evidence grows stronger with time. In the long run, the ideas that matter are those that remain standing after repeated attempts to tear them down. They do not survive because they are protected, but because they are correct enough to endure. Everything else fades. No matter how loudly it was once defended, real science survives being questioned. Lies don't. And in a world crowded with confident claims, the courage to question is not cynicism. It is the only reliable path to truth. Curiosity is powerful only when disciplined by doubt. On its own, curiosity is just motion, restless, energetic, and directionless. It drives us to ask questions, but it does not tell us which questions matter or which answers can be trusted. Without doubt, curiosity becomes naive enthusiasm. easily impressed and easily misled. Doubt is not the enemy of wonder, it is its guardian. It forces curiosity to slow down, to check its footing, to ask not only what if, but also how do we know. This restraint does not weaken curiosity, it sharpens it. A question tested by doubt becomes precise. An idea filtered through skepticism becomes meaningful. Unrestrained curiosity accepts stories too quickly. It mistakes novelty for insight and complexity for depth. It is drawn to explanations that feel exciting rather than those that are reliable. Doubt interrupts this pattern. It demands clarity. It insists that explanations earn belief instead of receiving it as a gift. The most valuable questions are not the loudest ones, but the most careful. They expose assumptions, challenge shortcuts, and refuse easy conclusions. Doubt teaches curiosity patience, the patience to wait for evidence, to tolerate uncertainty, and to abandon ideas that do not survive testing. There is a common misunderstanding that doubt kills creativity. In reality, it protects creativity from self-deception. When every idea is accepted without resistance, none of them improve. Resistance is what forces refinement. Doubt applies pressure, and pressure reveals structure. A curious mind without doubt will chase patterns that are not there. It will connect unrelated events and mistake coincidence for meaning. Doubt acts as a filter, separating signal from noise. It asks whether an observation is repeatable, whether an explanation predicts anything, whether it can be wrong. These questions prevent curiosity from drifting into fantasy. Discipline does not mean cynicism. It does not mean refusing to believe anything. It means believing carefully. Doubt does not say this is false. It says this is unproven. That distinction matters. It keeps the mind open without letting it become careless when curiosity and doubt work. Together, learning accelerates. Curiosity explores possibilities. Doubt evaluates them. One expands the space of ideas, the other contracts it toward what is reliable. This balance is how understanding grows, not explosively but steadily. The absence of doubt produces confidence without foundation. Ideas feel complete too early, questions stop, progress stalls. Doubt reopens the process by reminding us that understanding is provisional. Every answer is a temporary resting point, not a final destination. The world is complex enough to punish careless thinking. Patterns emerge, but they are subtle. Causes exist, but they are often hidden. To navigate this complexity, curiosity must be trained. Doubt is that training. It teaches humility, the recognition that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us immediately. In the end, curiosity alone can entertain, inspire, and distract. But only curiosity disciplined by doubt can discover. That discipline transforms wonder into knowledge and questions into insight. Curiosity is powerful only when disciplined by doubt. Because without doubt, curiosity does not seek truth, it seeks satisfaction. People love complicated answers, nature doesn't. Let me show you something embarrassingly simple. 2 slits and a screen, that's it. No philosophy, no poetry, just hardware. You fire particles one at a time, not waves, not clouds, one at a time. And somehow, impossibly, an interference pattern appears. That means each particle behaves as if it went through both slits. Now here's where reality starts sweating. You decide to check which slit the particle uses. Just check. You don't touch it, you don't push it, you only ask a question. The moment you ask, the pattern disappears, not because you disturb the particle, but because nature refuses to answer 2 questions at once. This is not about technology. This is about information. Here's the uncomfortable part. If you erase the information after the particle has already passed the slits, the outcome still changes. Read that again. Your present choice rewrites what the particle appears to have done in the past. So don't talk to me about time like it's a straight line. Time behaves more like a negotiation. Nature doesn't commit to a history until it's forced to. And that should bother you because it means reality isn't sitting there fully formed waiting for us. It's waiting for a question. If you think this proves the universe is magical, you're lazy. If you think it's nonsense, you're arrogant. The correct response is discomfort. Because the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. It only agrees to behave consistently when you stop lying to yourself about how simple it should be. And if you think you understand this experiment, you don't. That's not a failure. That's the beginning of intelligence. The simplest experiment that breaks reality doesn't require billion-dollar machines or exotic materials. It uses a wall, 2 narrow slits, a screen, and a single uncomfortable question. That's all it takes to humiliate common sense. You don't need advanced mathematics to feel the damage. You just need honesty. Imagine firing tiny particles, one by one, toward a barrier with 2 slits cut into it. Logic says each particle must choose one slit or the other. There are only two options, no mystery yet. But when you let the particles hit the screen behind the slits, a strange pattern appears. Not two simple clusters, but a series of bright and dark bands, a wave pattern. The kind you get when water overlaps with itself. That's impossible. A single particle cannot split itself into overlapping paths, and yet the pattern insists otherwise, even when the particles are sent one at a time, slowly, patiently, as if nature is daring you to accuse it of cheating. Each particle arrives alone, but together they build a pattern that only makes sense if each one behaved like a wave, exploring every possible path simultaneously. At this point, a reasonable person says, fine, let's catch it in the act. So you place a detector at the slits. Nothing violent. You're not smashing the particle. You're just asking a simple question, which slit did you go through? The moment you ask, reality flinches. The interference pattern disappears. The particles behave like ordinary objects again, choosing one slit, leaving behind two boring piles on the screen. No waves, no mystery, just obedience. This is where most explanations collapse, because it's tempting to say the detector disturbed the particle. That would be comforting. That would keep reality polite. But that explanation is wrong. The pattern disappears not because the particle was physically disturbed, but because information now exists. Nature doesn't care about your machines. It cares about what can be known. Here's the disturbing implication. The particle doesn't decide what it is until the question is settled, not until the information is locked in, and now the real trouble begins. You can design the experiment so that the decision to observe or not observe happens after the part. Eichel has already passed the slits. After, not before. Common sense screams that it's too late. The particle already chose its path. History should be fixed, but history refuses to cooperate. If the information is erased, the wave pattern returns, as if the particle never chose a path at all. If the information is preserved, the pattern vanishes, as if it always did. The present choice determines the past description. This is not philosophy. This is measured behavior. Reality behaves as if it keeps its options open, as if it delays committing to a story until it knows what questions will be asked. That should make you deeply uncomfortable, because it means the universe is not passively unfolding in time the way we imagine. We like to think time flows forward cleanly, cause first effect later. But this experiment laughs at that idea. It suggests that time is not a rigid chain, but a flexible bookkeeping system, adjusted to preserve consistency, not intuition. Notice what's missing here. There is no human consciousness required, no observer with a mind, no mystical intention, just the availability of information. Reality responds to what can in principle be known, not to who knows it. This destroys a very old assumption that particles are tiny things with definite properties, carrying their behavior with them through space and time. Instead, behavior emerges at the moment of interaction, when questions become unavoidable. The experiment doesn't say particles are confused. It says we are, because the universe is under no obligation to match the stories our brains prefer. Our brains evolved to throw spears and predict weather, not to understand a reality where outcomes depend on unanswered questions. And here's the intellectual trap. If you feel satisfied with any simple explanation, you've missed the point. Anyone who claims to intuitively understand this experiment is either lying or hasn't looked closely enough. The correct reaction is intellectual humility. Not confusion as weakness, but confusion as accuracy. This experiment stands as a warning. If such a simple setup can shatter our assumptions about objects, causality, and time, then the problem is not with the universe. The problem is with how confidently we think we understand it. Reality is not weird. Our expectations are, and the double slit doesn't care whether you like that fact. Nature doesn't decide until you look. And that statement sounds poetic until you realize it's a technical description, not a metaphor. It isn't saying reality waits for human attention. It's saying something far more disturbing. Outcomes are not fixed until information becomes unavoidable. We grow up believing the world is already there, fully formed, moving along a clean timeline, whether we pay attention or not. A rock falls, a bullet travels, a planet orbits. We assume the universe carries a complete script, and observation merely reveals what was already written. That assumption works beautifully for everyday life. It fails completely at the fundamental level. When you isolate a particle and remove every unnecessary interaction, it stops behaving like a tiny object with a defined path. It behaves like a collection of possibilities, not uncertainty due to ignorance, but genuine indeterminacy. The particle is not hiding a decision. There is no secret answer waiting to be uncovered. So when you look, you are not discovering a fact. You are forcing one. This is where people panic and start reaching for mystical language. Resist that impulse. Nothing supernatural is happening. The universe is not conscious. It is not watching you. It is doing something much colder and more precise. It is enforcing consistency between questions and answers. An outcome cannot exist without a context. A position cannot exist without a frame of reference. A path cannot exist without a way to distinguish paths. Without those, the question, what happened, is meaningless, and nature ref uses to answer meaningless questions. This is why measurement is not passive. Measurement is an interaction that limits possibilities. It doesn't disturb reality, it defines it. The act of looking doesn't add noise, it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is not a flaw in the system. It is the default state. The mistake is thinking of observation as peeking into a box. That image assumes the contents were already settled. A better image is locking a door. Once the door is locked, the building must decide which rooms are accessible. Before that, multiple routes remain valid. What's truly unsettling is that this decision doesn't have to be made immediately. Nature is remarkably patient. It allows multiple incompatible histories to coexist as long as no contradiction is exposed. Only when information is registered, when distinctions become irreversible, does the universe commit. This patience breaks our intuition about time. We imagine the past as fixed and the future as open. But at the quantum level, the past is only as fixed as the records that survive. Remove the records, and the past loosens its grip. This does not mean the past changes. It means the description of the past was never finalized. There is a crucial difference. The universe is not rewriting history. It is refusing to finalize it prematurely. This should demolish the comforting idea that particles carry properties like luggage as they move through space. Properties are not possessions. They are relationships. They only exist when something else demands them. Ask for position, and position appears. Ask for momentum, and momentum appears. Ask for a path, and a path appears. But ask for all of them at once, and nature simply says no, not because it's hiding something, but because the question itself is incoherent. This reveals something deeper about knowledge itself. Knowing is not a passive state. Knowledge is an active constraint imposed on reality. Every fact excludes alternatives. Every answer kills possibilities. That's the price of certainty. And nature is extremely economical with certainty. So when you look, you are not illuminating a dark room. You are burning away options. You are forcing the universe to take a stand where it previously refused to. That's why experiments don't just test theories. They shape what can be said about the world. Reality doesn't unfold independently of inquiry. It unfolds in response to it. This doesn't make science subjective. Quite the opposite. It makes it brutally objective. The rules governing which questions can be asked and which answers are allowed are rigid and unforgiving. Your preferences don't matter. Your intuition doesn't matter. Only consistency does. Nature doesn't decide until you look. Not because it's uncertain, but because uncertainty is more efficient than commitment. And until commitment is forced, possibility is not a bug. It's the feature that keeps the universe logically intact. If that bothers you, good. It should, because once you accept this, you can never again pretend that reality is simply out there, waiting patiently to be observed. Reality is something that crystallizes under pressure, and observation is the pressure point. And the moment you look, the universe answers, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. Time is not a straight line, and the sooner you stop pretending it is, the sooner reality starts making sense. The idea that the past is fixed, the present is a razor-thin moment, and the future is wide open feels obvious only because our brains were trained to survive, not to understand the structure of the universe. We experience time as a sequence, so we mistake experience for truth. Physics has no obligation to respect that mistake. In everyday life, cause comes before effect. You push a glass, it falls. You strike a match, it burns. This ordering is so reliable that we confuse it with a fundamental rule of existence. But that order is an AP. Approximation, not a law. It works at human scales, where information flows slowly and interactions are messy. Strip the system down to its most basic level, remove friction, noise, and excess interaction, and time stops behaving politely. At the fundamental scale, events are not arranged like beads on a string. They are arranged more like constraints in a logical system. What must be true, what cannot be true, and what is allowed to remain undecided for as long as possible. Time, in this sense, is not a river flowing forward. It is a bookkeeping process that ensures consistency. This is why certain experiments make it look as though the present is influencing the past. That description is misleading, but the discomfort it produces is earned. When an outcome depends on information that becomes available later, our instinct is to accuse time of running backward. In reality, what's happening is simpler and more disturbing. The story was never finalized in the first place. We assume the past is a completed archive, locked and immutable. But at the microscopic level, the past exists only as long as records exist. If no record survives that distinguishes between two histories, then insisting that one really happened is an emotional preference, not a physical necessity. Time doesn't demand that every event be immediately committed to history. It allows multiple compatible descriptions to coexist until a contradiction would arise. Only then does it enforce a single narrative. This idea clashes violently with common sense because common sense treats time as an external stage on which events march in order. Physics treats time as part of the system, something that interacts with information, measurement, and memory. Once you accept that, linear time stops being sacred. Consider this. If two different sequences of events lead to the same observable outcome, and no surviving evidence can distinguish between them, then insisting on one true sequence adds nothing to prediction. Nature has no incentive to pick one just to satisfy our storytelling instincts. This is not philosophy sneaking into physics. This is efficiency. The universe doesn't waste resources specifying details that cannot, even in principle, be observed. Definiteness is expensive. Ambiguity is cheap. So ambiguity is tolerated until it becomes logically impossible. From this perspective, the arrow of time, the feeling that time flows forward, is not fundamental. It emerges from asymmetries. Entropy increases, records accumulate, memories form. Once records exist, the past solidifies. Before that, it's flexible. This explains why we never experience the future influencing the past in daily life. Our world is flooded with records. Every interaction leaves traces. Air molecules, light, heat, memory. Everything is recording everything else. The past becomes overdetermined. There is no room left for ambiguity, but remove those records, isolate the system, and the rigidity dissolves. Then time stops behaving like a line and starts behaving like a set of conditions. What matters is not what happened first, but what must be true for the whole story to make sense. This reframing is uncomfortable because it strips time of its emotional authority. We want the past to be sacred. We want it locked. We want causality to be simple. But the universe does not care what feels comfortable. It only cares that its descriptions don't contradict themselves. So when experiments suggest that future choices affect past outcomes, the correct response is not to panic about paradoxes. The correct response is to recognize that you're imposing a linear story on a system that never promised to follow one. Time is not broken. Our intuition is, at the deepest level, the universe is not playing a movie frame by frame. It is solving a consistency problem. And time, as we experience it, is the shadow of that solution, not the engine driving it. Once you see time this way, many mister lose their drama. The question is no longer how can the future affect the past, but why did we ever assume the past was finalized before it had to be? Time is not a straight line. It's a rule book that only cares about coherence. And the moment you accept that, reality stops looking strange and starts looking brutally efficient. Particles behave like they know the future. And that sentence sounds reckless until you realize it is the least misleading way to describe what the equations and experiments are actually saying. No particle is predicting anything. No intelligence is hiding inside matter. Yet the behavior is impossible to explain if you insist that the particle only responds to its immediate past. Something else is going on, and it doesn't care whether it makes us comfortable. We are trained to think locally. A thing moves because it was pushed. A change happens because something hit it a moment earlier. This way of thinking works beautifully at human scales where interactions are slow, noisy, and isolated. But when you strip a system down to its fundamentals, locality stops being a law and becomes an approximation. In carefully controlled experiments, a particle's outcome depends on conditions that are arranged later in time. Change the experimental setup after the particle has already begun its journey, and the final pattern still adjusts as if the particle had access to information it should not have had, not because it knew the future, but because the description of its behavior was never confined to a single moment in time. The mistake is imagining the particle as a tiny traveler carrying instructions as it moves forward. That picture is intuitive and completely wrong. The particle is not a thing moving through time. It is a process that spans the entire experiment. The beginning, the middle, and the end are all part of one indivisible story. When you analyze the math honestly, you don't calculate what happens step by step in time. You calculate which outcomes are consistent with the entire setup. The system behaves as if it is aware of all the constraints, past and future alike. because the solution depends on the whole configuration, not on a sequence of causes. This is why the language of knowing the future keeps sneaking back in. It's not that the particle anticipates, it's that the universe does not privilege the present moment the way our minds do. We experience time as a flow, so we demand that explanations follow that flow. Physics does not share that demand. It allows descriptions that are global in time, descriptions where the beginning and the end jointly determine what is allowed in between. This doesn't violate causality in the way people fear. No usable signal travels backward in time. You cannot send a message to yesterday. The rules are tight. What breaks is not causality itself, but the childish version of it, where every effect must be traceable to a single earlier push. What replaces it is a more severe rule, consistency. The outcome must fit all constraints simultaneously. If a future measurement choice imposes a constraint, then earlier behavior must align with it, not because the past changed, but because it was never independently defined. This is deeply unsettling because it suggests that events are not born moment by moment. They are selected as a whole. Reality does not assemble itself frame by frame. It resolves itself all at once. At human scales, this distinction is invisible. The number of constraints is enormous. The past is buried under records. The future is constrained by entropy. Everything looks linear. But when you isolate a system enough to remove those constraints, the underlying structure is exposed. Then particles stop acting like objects and start acting like answers to a problem that hasn't been fully stated until the experiment is complete. This reframes what we mean by explanation. Instead of asking what caused this to happen then, the bet. Our question becomes, what global conditions made this outcome unavoidable? That shift feels alien because our intuition is wired for survival, not for consistency proofs. Particles don't know the future, but the universe doesn't wait for time to pass before enforcing its rules. It enforces them across time. Once you accept that, the weirdness loses its mysticism and gains something colder and more impressive: inevitability. The outcome is not guided by foresight, but by the refusal of the universe to allow contradictions, even if avoiding them requires behavior that looks, from our limited perspective, like knowledge of what hasn't happened yet. The future isn't being consulted, the present isn't in charge. And the past isn't sacred. There is only the full structure of the experiment, and the demand that the story taken as a whole makes sense. And if that makes particles seem prophetic, that says more about our assumptions than about their behavior. If you think you understand this, you're wrong. And that's not an insult, it's a diagnostic. The moment something feels intuitive, comfortable, or neatly summarized, you've already replaced the phenomenon with a story that fits inside your head. Reality at this level does not fit. The confidence you feel is not understanding, it's compression. And too much compression destroys the signal. Real understanding begins with resistance. It begins when your explanations stop working, when analogies collapse under their own weight, when every familiar picture turns out to be misleading. That discomfort is not a bug in the learning process. It is the only reliable sign that you are still in contact with the truth. At the deepest levels, the universe does not offer mechanisms you can visualize. It offers rules that produce outcomes, and those rules do not care whether your brain finds them reasonable. Our minds evolved to recognize faces, track moving objects, and predict short-term consequences. They did not evolve to grasp a reality where outcomes depend on unasked questions and histories remain undefined until forced. So when someone says they understand what's going on, what they usually mean is that they've found a metaphor they like. Waves, particles, past, probabilities. These are not explanations, they are linguistic crutches. Useful, temporary, and ultimately inadequate. The danger begins when we forget that the equations work. The predictions are flawless. The technology built on them functions with absurd precision. And yet, the moment you try to turn the math into a story about what is really happening, the floor drops out. Every story contradicts some experiment. Every picture breaks under scrutiny. That is not a failure of science. It is a failure of intuition. We crave a single coherent narrative where things have properties, events have causes, and time flows obediently forward. But the universe does not owe us that narrative. It only owes us consistency. And consistency at this scale does not look like common sense. The most honest thing you can say about this territory is that it resists understanding in the way we usually define it. You can calculate it, you can predict it, you can use it, but understand, as in visualizing a mechanism that feels right, that privilege is revoked. This is why false confidence is so dangerous here. The moment you think you've got it, you stop asking better questions. You start defending your explanation instead of testing it. You mistake familiarity for truth. History is littered with brilliant people who were wrong for exactly that reason. What survives are not the explanations that feel good, but the ones that refuse to collapse under experiment. Nature is ruthless. It does not negotiate. It does not care how elegant your interpretation is if it produces the wrong answer. And here's the humbling part. Even the people who built the framework knew they didn't understand it in the comforting sense. They knew how to calculate. They knew how to predict. And they knew exactly where intuition failed. That honesty is not weakness. It is intellectual discipline. Confusion, when properly aimed, is a form of precision. To say, I don't know what this means, is not to admit defeat. It is to refuse to lie. It is to draw a hard boundary between what the theory guarantees and what your imagination invents to fill the gaps. The universe at this scale is not asking to be visualized. It is asking to be respected. Respect here means not forcing it into human categories just to feel smart. So if you think you understand this, stop. Interrogate that feeling. Ask what assumptions you're smuggling in. Ask which metaphors you've mistaken for mechanisms. Ask what would break if you changed the question slightly. True engagement with this subject does not end in clarity. It ends in sharper questions and fewer illusions. Understanding, in the comforting sense, is a luxury reserved for simple systems. This is not one of them. And the moment you accept that, the moment you stop demanding that reality makes sense on your terms, you are closer to the truth than anyone who claims they've figured it out. Humans love to ask how far we can go into space, but that question is already wrong. The correct question is, how far does the universe allow us to go? Because space is not empty, it is a battlefield of distance, time, radiation, and energy, and humans are fragile visitors. Let's start with a simple fact that hurts our pride. The universe is not designed for us. No air, no warmth, no forgiveness. Even the nearest star is so far away that our fastest spacecraft would need tens of thousands of years to reach it. And that's not a technology problem. That's a physics problem. Everyone talks about faster engines. No one talks about the real jailer, speed itself. There is a universal speed limit, not because nature is cruel, but because it's consistent. Cross that limit and the equations break. Energy requirements explode toward infinity, meaning you don't almost reach it. You either obey it or you don't move at all. Now suppose we accept that limit and move as fast as reality allows. Another enemy appears, time. A journey to even nearby stars takes longer than a human life. So who arrives? Not the explorer, but their descendants. And by then, the reason for the journey may already be forgotten. Travel becomes not exploration, but inheritance. Then comes the final insult, energy. To move a human, protect them from radiation, keep them alive, and accelerate them to meaningful cosmic speeds requires absurd amounts of energy. Not a lot, not very difficult. Absurd. At some point, the universe is politely telling us this experiment is no longer worth running. And here's the uncomfortable conclusion. The universe may be filled with galaxies, stars, and planets, but access is not guaranteed. Knowledge travels easily. Light travels freely. But humans, we are slow, delicate, and bound to a small corner of space-time, and that's not a failure. That's a reminder. Our real power may not be how far we travel, but how deeply we understand the place we already occupy, because the universe doesn't care about our dreams, but it does reward those who learn its rules. And once you truly understand the limits, you stop asking childish questions about conquest and start asking adult questions about meaning. The universe is not built for humans, and that is not an opinion. It is a measurable fact written into every law of physics we've ever discovered. The moment you step outside the thin shell of air wrapped around Earth, survival drops from natural to impossible. No oxygen to breathe, no pressure to keep your blood from boiling, no magnetic shield to protect your DNA from being shredded by radiation. Space does not merely ignore us, it actively tries to dismantle us. That alone should force us to rethink how casually we talk about exploring it. On Earth, life evolved inside a narrow comfort zone. Temperature, gravity, chemistry, and time all cooperate just enough for fragile biology to survive. The universe outside that zone does not negotiate. A tiny mistake in pressure or heat kills a human in minutes. A small increase in radiation rewrites cells until cancer becomes inevitable. This isn't bad luck, it's a warning label. The universe isn't hostile in a moral sense, it's simply indifferent. And indifference at cosmic scales is lethal. Distance is the first wall we hit. Space is not big, it is obscenely big. The moon feels far until you realize it's practically next door. Mars is a longer walk, but still inside our neighborhood. Beyond that, the scale becomes ridiculous. The nearest star system is so distant that even light, the fastest thing reality allows, takes years to arrive. Human bodies do not operate on years in a metal box timelines. Bones weaken, muscles decay, minds unravel. Biology was never meant for prolonged isolation in artificial bubbles drifting through nothing. And this is where most optimistic ideas collapse. People imagine better engines, smarter ships, cleaner fuel. But the real limitation is not engineering, it is speed. Speed is expensive. Each small increase demands disproportionately more energy. Push harder, and the universe pushes back harder. Eventually, the math stops being inconvenient and starts being absurd. At some point, you're no longer building a spacecraft, you're trying to bribe reality itself. Even if you could move fast enough, time becomes your enemy. A journey that lasts decades may seem manageable on paper, but humans don't live on paper. They age, they break, they die. Interstellar travel quickly turns into a generational experiment where the people who arrive are not the ones who left and possibly no longer care why the journey began at all. Exploration loses meaning when memory dies before arrival. Then there's radiation, silent, invisible, relentless. Outside Earth's protective field, space is soaked in high-energy particles that slice through tissue and scramble DNA. Shielding helps, but shielding adds mass, and mass demands energy. Again, physics tightens the noose. You can't cheat one problem without feeding another. Every solution creates a new obstacle, and the obstacles stack faster than human ingenuity. Gravity itself betrays us. Our bodies evolved under a very specific gravitational pull. Remove it, and systems start failing. Hearts change shape. Vision degrades. Balance disappears. Put us in stronger gravity, and movement becomes torture. The universe offers almost no environments that sit comfortably within our biological tolerance. We are exquisitely specialized creatures trying to survive in a reality that prefers simplicity over comfort. What makes this hard to accept is not the science, it's the ego. Humans want to believe they are meant to spread everywhere, that intelligence automatically earns access to the cosmos. But intelligence does not override constraints. Knowing the rules does not grant permission to break them. The universe does not reward ambition, it rewards compliance with its laws, and yet this realization is not depressing, it's clarifying. It strips away fantasy and replaces it with honesty. We stop asking childish questions about conquering space and start asking adult questions about understanding it. We learn that sending machines is easy compared to sending flesh. Information travels far better than bodies ever will. Knowledge is the real interstellar traveler. The universe may not be built for humans, but it is built for comprehension. It allows us to observe, calculate, predict, and understand astonishing truths from a fragile planet orbiting an ordinary star. Perhaps that is the real miracle. Not that we can go everywhere, but that we can know so much without leaving home. And once you accept that, your focus shifts. Instead of dreaming about escaping Earth, you start appreciating how rare and delicate this place is. Instead of fantasizing about distant worlds, you realize how extraordinary it is that one world already works. The universe didn't make us explorers of space. It made us explorers of meaning. That may be the hardest limit to accept, but it may also be the most important one. Speed is the real prison, and most people don't realize they've already hit the bars. We talk about space travel as if distance is the enemy, but distance is only scary because of how slowly we are allowed to cross it. The universe doesn't stop us with walls or borders, it stops us with a number, a single unforgiving limit built into reality itself. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how intelligent we think we are confined by how fast we can move through space. Every dream of reaching distant stars eventually crashes into this limit. You can build bigger engines, burn more fuel, and invent smarter designs, but each step forward costs more than the last. Speed doesn't increase linearly, it punishes ambition. Doubling your speed doesn't double your energy needs, it multiplies each. Push hard enough and the required energy explodes beyond reason. At that point, you're no longer engineering a spacecraft, you're demanding the universe rewrite its own rules for your convenience. The cruel part is that the ultimate speed limit is not negotiable. It isn't a challenge to overcome or a milestone waiting for a breakthrough. It is woven into the structure of space and time themselves. Try to approach it, and mass becomes heavier, time behaves strangely, and energy demands climb toward infinity. There is no clever shortcut, no hidden loophole waiting to be discovered. The equations don't bend for hope. What makes this feel especially frustrating is how close the universe teases us. Light moves fast enough to cross unimaginable distances, carrying images of galaxies billions of years old straight into our telescopes. Information travels effortlessly across the cosmos while bodies remain trapped. We can see almost everything, but touch almost nothing. Vision without access becomes a special kind of torment, awareness without reach. Even if we imagine cruising at a respectable fraction of that ultimate speed, the consequences remain brutal. Time does not stay neutral. For travelers, it slows. For everyone else, it races ahead. A journey that feels manageable inside a ship can erase entire civilizations outside it. You don't return to the world you left. You return to a stranger, or more likely, you never return at all. Speed doesn't just limit travel, it fractures continuity. And then there's the human body, which reacts to high-speed travel not with adaptability but with resistance. Acceleration itself becomes a threat. Too much of it, and organs shift, blood pools, and consciousness fails. To move fast, you must accelerate slowly, which means spending even more time in transit. Speed once again tightens the trap. People often imagine a future where technology solves this problem, but that belief misunderstands the nature of constraints. Technology works inside physics, not outside it. You can optimize, refine, and improve, but you cannot negotiate with fundamental limits. The universe is not impressed by cleverness. It only responds to compliance. This is where optimism quietly turns into fantasy. Faster than light travel sounds exciting because it ignores the cost. It treats speed like a narrative device rather than a physical reality. But speed is not just motion. It is a relationship between energy, mass, and time. Break one, and the others break with it. The prison is perfectly balanced. What's most unsettling is that speed doesn't merely block exploration, it reshapes our understanding of existence. If reaching other stars takes longer than a human lifetime, then interstellar travel stops being personal. It becomes abstract, generational, or purely theoretical. The explorer is replaced by the project, meaning drains away when no one lives long enough to experience the result. And yet, this limitation forces an uncomfortable clarity. It reminds us that we are not meant to roam freely across the universe like tourists. We are localized creatures bound to a narrow slice of space-time. Our strength is not in how fast we move, but in how deeply we think. The universe lets us understand speed far better than it lets us use it. Speed is the real prison, not because it stops us from going forward, but because it exposes the boundary between imagination and reality. It shows us where dreams must submit to math. And in that submission, something important happens. We stop chasing impossible distances and start valuing the rare miracle of being here at all. The bars were never made of steel. They were made of numbers. Time betrays the traveler the moment the journey becomes long enough to matter. We imagine space travel as a problem of engines and destinations, but time is the quiet traitor hiding inside every plan. You can survive vacuum with technology, shield radiation with mass, and navigate DI. Stance with precision, but time cannot be sealed outside the spacecraft. It comes with you, distorts around you, and ultimately decides whether the journey has any meaning at all. At first, time seems cooperative. Days pass, routines form, systems run. But stretch the journey into years, then decades, and the betrayal begins. The human body is not a timeless machine. Cells age, bones weaken, muscles decay, and the brain slowly changes its chemistry. Even in perfect conditions, biology is on a countdown. Space does not pause that clock, it accelerates its consequences. Isolation, confinement, and monotony erode the mind long before the destination ever comes into view. The cruel irony is that physics makes this worse, not better. As speed increases, time stops behaving intuitively. For the traveler, clocks slow down. For the universe left behind, they race ahead. This sounds like a gift until you understand the cost. You may arrive feeling younger than expected, but everything you cared about has aged without you. Friends are gone, cultures have shifted, languages have evolved, home becomes a historical concept rather than a place. Time doesn't just pass, it severs continuity. This is where the idea of exploration quietly collapses. Exploration assumes return, comparison, shared experience. But a journey that stretches across generations destroys that structure. The people who leave are not the people who arrive. Purpose erodes when memory does not survive the trip. The mission becomes paperwork handed down through descendants who never chose it. At that point, travel stops being human and becomes procedural. Even if you ignore return and focus only on arrival, time still demands payment. A destination reached after a lifetime is not experienced the same way as one reached after an afternoon. Curiosity dulls, motivation shifts. The emotional reward that justified the journey evaporates long before the journey ends. Time doesn't just delay gratification, it dissolves it. Then there is the biological mismatch. Humans evolved under cycles, day and night seasons, aging alongside a stable environment. Long-duration travel breaks these rhythms. Artificial light replaces stars. Clocks become arbitrary. The mind, deprived of natural temporal anchors, begins to drift. Depression, cognitive decline, and psychological fragmentation are not side effects, they are predictable outcomes. Time, when stripped of context, becomes disorienting rather than informative. People like to imagine solutions, suspended animation, digital minds, extended lifespans. But each solution quietly admits defeat. Freeze the body and you remove the experience. Upload the mind and the traveler is no longer human. Extend life indefinitely and the journey loses urgency and meaning. Every workaround sacrifices the very thing travel was supposed to preserve. What makes time's betrayal so profound is that it doesn't feel like an enemy at first. It feels patient, reasonable. It allows planning, scheduling, optimism. Only later does it reveal the truth that meaning is time-bound. Experiences matter because they happen within a finite window. Stretch that window too far, and experiences lose their sharpness, their urgency, their emotional weight. In the end, time exposes a hard truth about our place in the universe. We are not designed for epics measured in millennia. We are designed for stories measured in decades. Our ambitions may reach the stars, but our significance is anchored to a lifespan that makes such distances impractical. This isn't a failure of imagination. It's a reality check. Time betrays the traveler not out of malice, but out of consistency. It applies the same rules everywhere, without exception. And in doing so, it teaches us something uncomfortable but essential. The universe may be vast, but meaning is local. It lives in moments that cannot be postponed indefinitely. Once you understand that, the obsession with distant futures fad. You stop treating time as something to outrun and start treating it as something to respect. Because the real tragedy is not that we can't travel far enough. It's that we might waste the time we already have chasing destinations that will never arrive while we're still alive to care. Energy costs become absurd the moment ambition outruns realism. At small scales, effort feels proportional to reward. Burn a little fuel, move a little farther. But the universe does not scale politely. Push beyond the familiar and energy stops being a tool and starts becoming a tyrant. Every extra bit of speed, every added layer of protection, every extension of distance demands not just more energy, but wildly more, to the point where the numbers stop feeling physical and start feeling imaginary. This is where most space travel fantasies quietly collapse. We picture sleek ships gliding between stars, but we rarely ask what it actually costs to move mass through space at extreme speeds. Energy is not free, and it is not forgiving. Accelerating a tiny probe is manageable. Accelerating a human-rated spacecraft is a different category of problem entirely. Add life support, radiation shielding, redundancy and safety margins, and the mass balloons. Each added kilogram multiplies the energy required, not just to move, but to keep moving. The trap is exponential growth. Energy requirements don't rise gently, they curve upward sharply, then violently. At first the curve looks manageable, then it turns steep, then it goes vertical. Beyond that point, the concept of more fuel stops making sense. You would need energy outputs comparable to stars to push a single vehicle to meaningful interstellar speeds, not to explore the galaxy, just to reach the next star within a human-relevant time frame. And energy is never isolated. Producing it has costs, storing it has costs, controlling it safely has costs. High-energy systems generate heat that must be removed, radiation that must be contained, and risks that multiply with scale. A machine powerful enough to accelerate a crewed ship to extreme speeds becomes, by necessity, a machine that can easily destroy itself. Stability becomes as hard as propulsion. This leads to a brutal reality. Space travel does not fail because we lack imagination. It fails because imagination ignores bookkeeping. Physics keeps perfect accounts. Every joule must come from somewhere. Every inefficiency compounds. You can't cheat by being clever. Cleverness just shifts where the bill arrives. Eventually, it arrives in full, even slowing down costs energy. You don't just spend energy to leave. You spend it again to stop. Momentum doesn't care about your plans. A ship arriving at high speed must dump that energy somewhere, and space offers very few safe places to put it. The faster you go, the harder it is to arrive intact. The universe charges you twice, once for ambition and once for control. This absurdity forces an uncomfortable comparison. On Earth, the energy required to move people across continents feels trivial. Planes, ships, and rockets make distance seem conquered. But that familiarity hides how special our situation is. Earth gives us gravity wells, atmospheres, and abundant energy sources. Strip those away, and movement becomes brutally expensive. Space removes all the subsidies we take for granted. People often propose breakthroughs, perfect reactors, exotic fuels, revolutionary engines, but even perfect efficiency doesn't save you from scale. Efficiency reduces waste, it doesn't eliminate demand. When the demand itself becomes astronomical, perfection barely moves the needle. The problem isn't inefficiency, it's magnitude. At some point, energy costs stop being a technical challenge and become a philosophical one. Why spend stellar amounts of energy to move a handful of fragile organisms across a void that offers no guarantee of return? The universe doesn't forbid it explicitly. It simply makes it irrational. The cost-benefit analysis collapses under its own weight. This is not pessimism, it is clarity. It tells us where physical exploration makes sense and where it doesn't. It explains why robotic probes outperform crude missions at extreme distances, and why information travels farther than bodies ever will. Data is light. Humans are heavy. Energy costs become absurd as a way of drawing a boundary. Not a wall, but a curve that steepens until progress becomes indistinguishable from fantasy. Understanding that curve doesn't diminish humanity, it refines it. It forces us to choose battles that matter and investments that pay off. The universe is not telling us to stop dreaming. It is telling us to count the cost. And when the numbers grow so large that they swallow the dream itself, wisdom is knowing when to change the dream rather than bankrupt reality trying to fulfill it. The final irony is that the universe may be overflowing with destinations, yet almost none of them are meant to be reached by us. After all the equations, all the ambition, all the technological bravado, we arrive at a quiet, unsettling realization. The cosmos is not limited by lack of wonders, but by access. It shows us everything and offers us almost nothing to touch. We look up and see galaxies by the billions, stars by the trillions, planets scattered like dust. The scale invites conquest, or at least visitation. But the same laws that allow us to see so far also prevent us from going far. Light crosses the universe with ease, matter does not. Awareness travels freely, bodies remain trapped. The universe reveals itself generously, then locks the door. This is the opposite of what intuition promises. Intelligence feels like a passport. We assume that understanding earns permission. But the universe does not trade access for insight. It hands us knowledge without mobility, vision without reach. The smarter we become, the clearer the confinement appears. Progress doesn't open the cage, it illuminates the bars. There is a deeper irony hiding here. The more we learn about the universe, the more local we realize our lives must be. Grand cosmic narratives collapse into fragile human timelines. Interstellar empires turn into logistical absurdities. Colonizing the stars sounds heroic until the numbers drain it of romance. The future becomes less about expansion and more about endurance. What makes this hard to accept is that limitation feels like failure. We are conditioned to believe that every boundary exists to be broken. But some boundaries are not challenges, they are definitions. They tell you what kind of universe you live in. This one allows understanding without domination, curiosity without conquest. That is not a flaw. It is a feature the irony sharpens when you consider where meaning actually lives. It does not scale with distance. It scales with experience. A planet across the galaxy is emotionally irrelevant compared to a moment here that changes a life. The universe gives us infinite scenery, but meaning remains stubbornly finite. We are not built to care about everything, only about what fits inside a human lifespan, and yet we keep reaching outward, hoping that distance itself will provide significance. But distance is empty. It is just more space between events that matter. The universe may be vast, but vastness alone is not purpose. Purpose emerges from interaction, from consequences that unfold within time frames we can feel. This is where the final irony becomes unavoidable. The same laws that prevent us from roaming the cosmos are the laws that make our existence precious. Finiteness creates urgency, limits create focus. If we could go anywhere at any time, nothing would matter very much. Scarcity is not just a constraint, it is a source of value. The universe does not owe us access to its farthest corners. It has already given us something far rarer, the ability to comprehend it from a small, stable platform where life can persist long. Enough to ask questions. We are not cosmic tourists, we are cosmic witnesses. That role may sound smaller, but it is not. To understand a universe you cannot fully explore is a profound position. It means your importance is not measured by territory, but by insight. Not by how far you travel, but by how deeply you see. The final irony, then, is not that we are trapped on one planet. It is that this trap is precisely what allows consciousness, culture, science, and meaning to exist at all. The universe closes the door to endless expansion, then hands us a window wide enough to see almost everything, And maybe that is the point, not to go everywhere, but to understand enough of what we can see to live wisely where we are.